There is a quiet adjustment that happens before words are spoken. A pause, a recalculation. The sentence is softened, shortened, or never said at all. Not because it's untrue, but because it might create friction. The moment passes smoothly. Harmony is preserved. Nothing escalates. And yet, something subtle is lost in the process. People who avoid conflict at all costs rarely experience themselves as fearful or passive. They often see themselves as considerate, diplomatic, emotionally intelligent. They read the room. They anticipate reactions. They know when something could turn tense and instinctively steer away from it. The intention isn't to lie or submit, but to keep things calm, stable, manageable. In everyday situations, this shows up quietly, agreeing when something feels off, letting small frustrations slide, choosing silence over correction, smiling through discomfort. Not because the issue isn't noticed, but because addressing it feels heavier than carrying it. The priority becomes emotional smoothness, even if it comes at the expense of clarity. Because nothing explodes, the pattern stays invisible. Relationships continue, work continues, conversations remain polite. Avoiding conflict feels like maturity, like control. But beneath that surface, a tension accumulates, not outwardly, but inwardly. The cost isn't immediate disruption, it's the gradual distance between what is felt and what is expressed. This pattern is often reinforced by positive feedback. Avoiding conflict keeps situations calm, it prevents awkward moments, it maintains connection. From the outside, it looks like emotional skill. From the inside, it feels like relief. The discomfort is postponed, not confronted. And because the immediate outcome is smooth, the strategy appears to work. From a psychological perspective, conflict avoidance is less about fear of disagreement and more about fear of emotional disruption. Tension threatens stability. Raised voices, disappointment, or disapproval introduce uncertainty. For some people, that uncertainty feels overwhelming, even when the stakes are small. Avoidance becomes a way to regulate emotion, not only others' emotions, but their own. Over time, the mind learns a simple rule: harmony equals safety, disagreement equals risk. This rule doesn't require conscious belief to operate. It shapes reactions automatically. Words are filtered, boundaries are softened, needs are minimized, not because they don't exist, but because expressing them might disturb the balance. Behaviorally, this creates a subtle shift. The person becomes skilled at sensing others, but less practiced at representing themselves. The relationship stays intact, but uneven. And while nothing seems wrong on the surface, the internal cost begins to grow, quietly, consistently, and without immediate warning. There is a moment when this avoidance becomes most visible. It usually appears right before a boundary would need to be drawn, a preference clarified.
A disagreement named. The words are close enough to be spoken. The feeling is clear enough to be acknowledged. And then, almost automatically, the impulse shifts towards smoothing things over. The tension is neutralized before it has a chance to exist. From a behavioral standpoint, this is where conflict avoidance does its quiet work. The person isn't choosing silence because they don't care. They are choosing it because they care deeply about maintaining emotional equilibrium. The priority becomes preventing discomfort rather than expressing truth. And in that moment, harmony feels more urgent than honesty. Psychologically, this pattern is tied to anticipation. The mind predicts emotional fallout before it happens. Disapproval, disappointment, distance. Even mild conflict is imagined as costly, so the system intervenes early. It edits words, refrains needs, or abandons the point altogether. Not because the issue is unimportant, but because the emotional price feels too high. As this repeats, the brain learns to associate self-expression with disruption. Speaking up feels risky. Staying quiet feels safe. Over time, this creates a habit of internal negotiation, where the self is consistently the side that compromises first. As this pattern repeats, it begins to reshape the internal landscape. Needs don't disappear, but they are gradually pushed inward. Frustration doesn't surface openly, it settles quietly. Over time, this creates a specific kind of emotional load. Not anger, not resentment in the usual sense, but accumulation. Small, unspoken moments stacking on top of one another. Psychologically, avoiding conflict requires constant self-monitoring. Tone is adjusted, reactions are softened, words are filtered before they leave the mouth. This ongoing regulation consumes mental energy. The person stays attentive to others' comfort, often at the expense of their own. And because this effort is invisible, it's rarely acknowledged as work. It simply becomes how things are handled. There is also a subtle effect on self-perception. When boundaries are repeatedly softened or withheld, the sense of personal clarity begins to blur. It becomes harder to tell what is genuinely acceptable and what is merely tolerated. Preferences lose sharpness. Discomfort becomes familiar. The self adapts to the environment rather than shaping it. Nothing dramatic happens. Relationships remain intact. Situations stay calm. But beneath that calm, something shifts. The person becomes easier to accommodate others and less practiced at accommodating themselves. The absence of conflict is maintained, but at the cost of internal alignment. Over time, the cost of constant avoidance begins to surface in subtle ways, not through open conflict, but through quiet emotional distance. The person may start to feel misunderstood without being able to point to a single moment where understanding failed. Conversations continue, yet something feels unsaid.
Connection remains, but it feels thinner than it once did. From a psychological perspective, conflict plays an important role in maintaining relational clarity. It allows differences to surface, boundaries to be tested, and expectations to be adjusted. When conflict is consistently avoided, these processes stall. Relationships stay peaceful but static. Growth is replaced by maintenance. Stability is preserved, but depth is limited. This can lead to a particular kind of exhaustion, not from arguments, but from restraint. Holding back reactions, rephrasing thoughts, and absorbing discomfort internally requires ongoing effort. Because the tension never releases outwardly, it circulates inward. The body stays calm, but the mind carries unresolved weight. There is also a slow erosion of authenticity. When self-expression is repeatedly delayed or diluted, it becomes harder to recognize which parts of oneself are being protected and which are being suppressed. The person may feel adaptable, agreeable, even easygoing, while quietly losing contact with what they actually want or need. Perhaps the most important shift happens when conflict avoidance is no longer seen as kindness alone, but as a pattern with consequences. Avoiding tension doesn't remove it, it relocates it. What isn't expressed outwardly is held inwardly, and over time, that holding becomes part of how the person relates to themselves. This doesn't mean conflict must be sought or intensified. It means recognizing that discomfort is sometimes the price of alignment. Expressing a boundary, naming a disagreement, or allowing tension to exist briefly can feel destabilizing at first, but avoiding it indefinitely creates a different kind of instability, one where the inner and outer worlds slowly drift apart. Psychologically, growth in relationships often requires tolerating short-term discomfort for long-term clarity. When conflict is avoided at all costs, clarity is postponed. The relationship stays smooth, but the self becomes less visible within it. Harmony is preserved, but presence is diluted. Noticing this pattern doesn't create instant change. It creates awareness, and awareness introduces choice where reaction once ruled. The moment when silence is selected automatically becomes visible. The urge to smooth things over can be observed rather than obeyed. It may be worth noticing when conflict is avoided reflexively, what feels at risk in that moment, and what might quietly be lost by staying silent again. In many cases, the fear isn't of conflict itself, but of what honesty might disrupt. Here, these patterns are observed calmly.